Hi everybody, this time we are talking about social class. We will be talking about defining stratification and inequality, systems of stratification, and theories of stratification. For this recording and the next couple recordings, I will be doing it in a classroom. I hope the audio isn't too much of an issue. Please let me know if it is. So when we talk about social class, we talk about social stratification. When we use this term, we are talking about the division of society into groups arranged by social hierarchy. Every society has some form of stratification. This includes variations in race, class, and gender, also known as criteria, systems, and severity. So basically, when we talk about social stratification, we're talking about the ways that we put some people at higher positions in society than other people. And unfortunately, us humans are very good at this kind of thing. When we talk about social inequality, then, in regard to social stratification, we are talking about the unequal distribution of wealth, power, or prestige of the members of society. So, because we say some people are at higher points than other people, this then leads to social inequality, where by virtue of being at a higher position, you have more power, prestige, and usually wealth. So let's talk about systems of stratification itself. Slavery is the most extreme form of social stratification and is based on the legal ownership of people and the treatment of people as property. Within the United States, we had the most severe historically version of slavery to have ever existed in the world. There were other forms of slavery that existed prior to American slavery. However, American slavery was systematic and it was almost in just short of being industrial. So it was capable of incorporating so many more people and kidnapping so many more people from Africa and bringing them here. We see in this image one of the most brutal elements. Well, it stands as a testament to how brutal slavery was in the United States. That is a slave mask, and those masks were put on people to move them from one place to another for days, possibly even weeks at a time. And you'll note that little curled piece that appeared to have gone inside the mouth, and it went inside the mouth. That was to keep slaves quiet. So basically what would happen to you is you would be choking on that thing for, days or weeks or whatever. And of course, you have metal in your mouth, so teeth would probably be broken and that you'd be gagging. Really savagely brutal stuff. And I never miss an opportunity to stress how hideous of a thing slavery in the United States was, and that we cannot forget that that happened. A caste system, then, is a form of government, a form of social stratification in which status is determined by one's family history and background, and this cannot be changed. The most well-known and longest-lasting version of a caste system to have existed in world history is the Indian caste system. And within that system, people are given a profession at birth because their family has always been in that caste. It is an incredibly intricate system, but to simplify it, we have people of very high status in the caste system, people of middle status. Excuse me. Oh, please excuse me. People of middling status and people of very low status. And within that system, those people couldn't escape. So if you were a low status individual, your family had always been garbage collectors, sorry about that, or butchers or whatever, then you would be trapped being that thing for the rest of your life. And there's almost nothing that could be done about that. Now, it should be noted, the caste system was officially made illegal in the 1940s in India. However, just as we have racism in the United States largely based off of the social structures that existed during the time of slavery. Similarly, in India, there still is discrimination based on caste, and there still are certain social structures that are oriented toward caste that are seen as being part of the rich tradition of India. Uh, it's a very interesting system. Apartheid, then, is a term for a system of segregation of racial and ethnic groups that existed in South Africa between 1948 and 1991. So this was a relatively short-lived stratification system, but it was a very specific stratification system. Just like American segregation as it existed in the 1900s in the United States, I believe from about 1920 to about 1960, if I'm correct. Similarly, white people and black people, and also what they called, so the classifications were white, black, colored, and Asian, if I remember correctly, were the classifications. And people of different statuses were not allowed in the same parts of town as the others. So it was more exaggerated than the whites only, blacks only, water fountains and facilities as existed in the United States. It was entire portions of town you were not allowed to be in unless you were of a certain race. And that was dictated by passports and checkpoints and that sort of thing. Again, I use the term interesting to mean something that is also terrible too. But historically, a very interesting thing was the apartheid system in South Africa. Social class is another form of stratification. This is the form of stratification that exists in the United States and many other capitalist countries around the world. This is a system based on access to resources such as wealth, power, or property, and prestige. Sociologists often refer to social class as socioeconomic status. Social class and SES are not exactly the same thing, but SES is used to measure social class. So just as the heat from a fire isn't everything happening on the fire, you certainly can measure many elements of the fire based off of the heat that it gives off. So let's talk about the class system as it exists in the United States. First, we have the upper class. These are the wealthiest people in the class system. They make up about 1% of the total U.S. population, and they possess most of the wealth in this country. Upper class individuals are usually relatively difficult to contact. We don't encounter them very often unless we ourselves are of the upper class. This is because they like to hide themselves. They have their own parts of town. They have gated communities. They have their own private country clubs, and they like it that way. Upper middle class are the next people in our class system. If you know somebody that's rich, they're probably upper middle class. These people that are professionals, including lawyers and doctors, as well as managers. The upper middle class make up about 14% of the total U.S. population. The middle class consists primarily of what we would call white-collar workers. These are people who would work in office-type settings. The middle class in the United States has a broad range of incomes and make up about 30% of the total U.S. population. There are grids in your book actually that lay out what exactly the amount of money made by people of these various statuses are. So you can look that up if you like. An interesting element about the middle class, and we'll see this in a documentary you're going to be watching this week, is that most people in the United States believe themselves to be middle class, but only 30% of the population actually are middle class. And that is a very interesting phenomena particular to the United States. There are very few places around the world that have such a belief in being middle class and almost a morality to being middle class as the United States. So that's one element that makes middle class status interesting. Working class people. These are our blue collar, our manufacturing, or our service industry workers. Working class, also known as lower middle class people, are less likely to have college degrees, and they make up about 30% of the total U.S. population. Lower class people. These are mainly poor people who typically have lower levels of literacy than other classes, and they make up 20% of the U.S. population. Now, when we say lower rates of literacy, that's not a moral judgment call. That's not saying, oh, look how terrible these people are, they never read any books. It could be that they've never had the opportunity to build that skill set because maybe most likely they didn't go to college, so they never learned how to really engage in literature in that way. They never built habits of reading. It could be they don't have time, right? If you have 3 jobs trying to feed a family, you probably don't have time to sit down and read, and if you do, you fall asleep almost immediately. So that lower levels of literacy is a observation, and there is no way that it indicates lack of morality of the lower class. Here is a chart. That's one way, I believe this is in your book, one way of breaking down the class structure in the United States. You will note there is a difference between working poor and underclass placed here. The underclass individuals are those making less than $75,000 a year, and that's a valid breakdown and additional to that. Otherwise, this chart is the same as what I just presented you. Now let's talk about some sociological theories of class. Marx, of course, right? Marx was obsessed with social class, and he had a lot to say about class. Marx believed that there were 2 primary socialist classes in capitalist societies. There were the capitalists, or as he called the bourgeoisie, who owned the means of production. What makes capitalists unique or interesting to Marx is that they control the things that make other things. So a reminder, those means of productions are things like property that can be farmed, or a McDonald's, or a factory, or something that is used to make other things. And then workers, or as Marx called them, the proletariat, sold their labor to the capitalist for wages. So the capitalists need the workers, but they only pay them as much as they could possibly get away with. Marx believed that social classes would remain divided and social inequality would grow over time. Data has shown that. Not quite as quickly as Marx probably would have anticipated, but it has shown that social inequality is continuing to grow over time. Since the 2008 economic downturn, we've actually seen social inequality skyrocket. And Marx acknowledged the existence of other classes, but they were not central to the primary struggle. So while Marx recognized that there were classes other than the rich, that 1%, and the working class, there were also other classes involved in there too. So the very, very poor, small business, or small business owners, those were also groups he was interested in. But it's primarily the people that sell their labor for wages. Those are the people Marx is interested in. It's also important to note that it's not just, as I discussed just a moment ago, the working class and the middle class that he would classify in that proletariat class. Let me restate that. He would include both working class and middle class people in the proletariat class. It's not just those lower middle class people in that proletariat class. It's both the middle class and the working class. Weber then, reminder, it's pronounced Max Weber, not Max Weber. Weber offered a similar model that also included cultural factors. So in this way, Weber refined Marx's argument. He argued that class status was made of 3 components. There was wealth, what we know as property, power, and also prestige. So Marx was primarily concerned with that private property, or maybe the amount of money the person had. But Weber said, wait a minute, wealth is important, but we also need to consider how powerful the person is. We also need to consider the prestige, or how well the community thinks of that person. Here we have a table, table 7.1, that illustrates the difference between wealth and prestige. So we see at the at the middle bottom to that list. So imagine this as two lists put together with that second column that says 49 would be directly under the first column that also says 49 at the bottom. We see toward the bottom of the second column people like truck driver, elevator operator, garbage collector. Those are people that we hold to have relatively low status in our society. And these people are ordered in terms of status in that prestige score. Sorry about that. And then we also see what's something that doesn't, child care worker. That's probably people that we hold relatively high. Let's see another. Funeral director. Funeral director is relatively high prestige score, and at 49, and probably relatively a relatively good amount of money. Social worker, on the other hand, at 52 is also relatively high prestige. Social workers do not make very much money. As the spouse of a social worker, I can tell you that. You will note college/university professor at 74. And I can tell you, college and university professors do not make nearly as much money as lawyers, architects, chemists, physicists, aerospace engineers. That I wish, but it doesn't happen. So the point of this chart is that there is a disconnect between the amount of prestige held by an individual and the amount of money they make per year. Weber can, structural strain theory then. Structural functionalist theory suggests that the system of stratification that has emerged in society is functional and it serves society in many ways. So there are certain roles that are more important for the functioning of society, and those roles may be more difficult to fill, so more incentive is needed. So that's why we have CEOs who make millions of dollars, is because it's really hard to find a good CEO, and we need to make that competitive, because no one would ever want to do that job if it wasn't highly competitive. And it then makes the argue that greater rewards are necessary for work that requires more training or skill. Conflict theorists would strongly disagree with that. You do see in societies where wages are not as high that people still continue to be doctors, even though they're not as financially driven to do so. So there's functionalist theory isn't perfect for accounting for social class, but it has its own perspective. Postmodernist theory, which we don't talk about too much, we have Pierre Bourdieu, who attempted to explain social reproduction, which is the tendency for social class status to be passed down from one generation to the next. So we do observe this, that rich people tend to have children who tend to go on and continue to be rich. Poor people tend to have children that tend to go on and continue to be poor. And sociologists and other social scientists have observed that that is a consistent trend. If your parents are of one class status, chances are you will be of a similar class status. And if you're not of the same class status of your parents, you will be of a similar status. So maybe your parents were working class and they worked real hard to save the money to send you to college, and then through your work you can get up to being middle class, but you're not going to be hyper rich, chances are, because you don't have the resources for that. Bourdieu accounted for this by a phenomenon known as cultural capital. So each class has its own set of cultural capital, which are its tastes, its habits, its expectations, its skills, etc., which helps those people of that class gain advantages within that class status. Thus, our cultural capital either helps us or hurts us as we become adults, depending on the social setting we put ourselves in. If I am a hyper-rich person, I've been taken to the theater every weekend or every month by my parents, I know how opera works. I know how really fancy art works. My parents have encouraged me to be well-read, those sorts of things. I can impress another upper class person by saying something, by comparing one Italian opera to another and saying something really snobby like, well, I can't even think of anything because I don't know my opera all that well. But comparing operas, comparing high art, comparing very expensive wines, saying things like, well, this wine has a good set of legs on it, whatever the hell that means, right? Um, but it exists on the middle class and lower classes as well. If I talk about how awesome the Lobos are doing this year at uh, football or whatever they're doing well at, I'm not exactly a sports dude, uh, then that has a certain cultural capital to lower and middle class people, right? So you use different types of cultural capital in different settings. So if I'm interviewing for a middle class job, then it wouldn't necessarily hurt me if I could talk about how great the big game was, right? And that's also using cultural capital to your advantage. Symbolic interactionists examine the way that we use status differences to categorize ourselves and others. So we figure out, based on looking at each other, based on the symbols on their bodies, whether someone is a rich person, a poor person, someone of high status, someone of low status. We look at speech, how somebody speaks, their gestures, their possessions, their friends, what they do on the weekend, and other socioeconomic statuses. So if someone's driving a really fancy car, we might assume that they're rich. But it becomes less obvious than that. If somebody is very neat and very well put together, we might also assume that they're rich. If someone is very articulate and smooth and skilled with speaking, we might also make those assumptions. If somebody has problems with their teeth, we often make the assumption, rightly or wrongly, that they are poor. There are other assumptions people make of people that have problems with their teeth, namely that they are some kind of deviant or some kind of criminal. There are a lot of unfortunate social aspects that go along with teeth I actually find quite interesting, especially in an era where methamphetamine use is a problem. But that's for another class. So that's the end of this lecture. I look forward to talking to you again on the next lecture, and happy studying.